Hey kids, I'm in tremendous pain, but you can call me Boxman. Today, I'm going to be building a model of the Titanic that can sink and split kind of like the real ship did, using a suitable model kit, my incredible craftsmanship skills, and a homicide evidence disposal machine. Ever since I was a wee lad, I've had a weird obsession with the Titanic and YouTube videos of model boats sinking. So it's only natural that the one thing I wanted most in this mortal plane of existence was the Titanic submersible model. It's a wholesome little toy that you can take with you to the pool to reenact a horrific disaster that took the lives of 1,500 people. Nowadays they're so rare that the only way to actually obtain one is by coughing up $1,000 on eBay. That's a pretty tall ask for what's basically a 9/11 themed Jenga set, so instead I'll take you through the trials and tribulations of ripping off this insensitive toy. But before we get into that, I drove my car into a lake, which is why this video is sponsored by World of Warships. World of Warships is a free-to-play naval warfare extravaganza available on PC. With over 600 ships across 10 nations and 5 distinct classes, there's bound to be something that speaks to you. If you're like me, then you exclusively play battleships, just so you can gawk at how beautifully detailed your ship looks, contribute nothing for the whole match, and lose so hard that your team starts posting your name and address in chat. Or play as aircraft carriers, and dunk on the entire enemy team with such historical accuracy that they start posting your name and address in chat. Whatever you choose, be it cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and more, you're bound to be immersed in the game's stunning graphics. With water so real, you can almost forget about that suspicious white van parked down the road. Download World of Warships using the link in the description below. Remember to register using code BRAVO to receive a Titanic starter pack that includes 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium time, and a free ship after you complete 15 battles. First, I need to choose the right model kit to undergo this brutal procedure. The best option, hands down, would be Revell's vintage 1/570th scale Titanic, because it's simple, cheap, and relatively large, which gives you a lot of room to fuck up. But I want to make things unnecessarily difficult by sticking to 1/700th scale, because that's what all my other model boats are, which limits my options to 5 kits: Revell, Hobby Boss, Zvezda, Meng, and Academy. Right off the bat, those last 3 are dragged out and administered a lethal dose of lead, because they look like garbage. But more importantly, in the case of Meng and Academy, they're snap-fit kits, meaning they have a lot of excess structural weight, which is going to make it near impossible to have the model float at the correct depth without being top-heavy. So now it's down to Revell versus Hobby Boss. I ended up buying both. Whichever one is worse will be the subject of today's video, while the better one will be saved for a more dignified build. Revell's kit was released in 2012, and for 11 years it was arguably the best 1/700th scale Titanic model you could buy, until Hobby Boss decided to pull up and brutally gun it down in a drive-by shooting. When comparing the two, it's not even close. Hobby Boss's kit represents the pinnacle of injection molding technology, and it's going up against a model whose engineering is practically identical to a kit my great-grandfather would have picked up at a hobby store during the war. On Terror. Honestly, I just wanted a chance to shit on it all. We begin construction with perfectly sane scale modeling activities, such as gluing the halves of the hull together using Tamiya extra thin cement. Thanks to capillary action, the cement spreads out as much as possible, like my buddy Josh when he sees a pregnant woman on the subway, which ensures that I only need to lightly dot my applicator in a few areas. After sealing the rest of the openings in the hull by attaching Titanic's rudder and propeller shafts, I make sure the hull is waterproof with a quick dunk into a repurposed drawer. After which it's time to add the iceberg damage. A common misconception is that the iceberg ripped a giant 300-foot gash into Titanic's side, while in reality, it pushed Titanic's riveted shell plating apart, creating several openings that were tens, perhaps hundreds, of millimeters wide. To emulate this, I take a rotary tool to the inside of the hull to create small holes without destroying the exterior hull detail, which I then forcefully make wider using a knife. As a result, my Titanic looks like it took a wrong turn while out for a stroll in Birmingham, but adding a few bits of plastic to simulate the damaged hull plates takes us down from murder to the 2nd degree. Now, before I do anything else, now's a good time to saw this boat in half. If the cut isn't precise, the entire model will be ruined, which is why I eyeball where to make the cut using a sloppily drawn line that I'm only 50% certain is aligned with the aft expansion joint. To make the cut, I opt to use a bandsaw, which I've only ever used for nefarious purposes. So to calm my nerves, I do a test run on the spare Titanic hull I just had lying around, which goes swimmingly, so I do it for real this time, and thanks to the ice in my veins, I cruised right through it.
Shut the fuck.
With that out of the way, I use sandpaper to clean up the rough edges, and add a plastic lid to the stern so that the two halves of the ship can lock together. To prevent water from rushing along the length of the ship and just pulling it down vertically, watertight bulkheads must be installed, which need to be tall enough to restrict flooding but make them too tall and water won't be able to spill over them, meaning not only does Jack get charged with theft, but he also gets cancelled on Twitter. Using 0.5mm styrene sheets, I traced the bulkheads provided in the kit, and then trimmed them down as needed before gluing them into the hull. While the real Titanic had 15 watertight bulkheads, I decided to install just 5 in the bow, 2 in the stern, and none in my car, because my wife can't swim. The ship is almost ready for its first sinking test. To prevent it from capsizing the second it touches water, I gather a few pennies to use as ballast because they'll be worth more inside this toy boat than they ever were in my parole officer's wallet. I also mark the ship's waterline so I can see if it floats at the proper level before temporarily connecting the bow and stern using tape. I'm looking for 2 things in this test. Water needs to be able to spill out of the compartments opened up by the iceberg damage, and the stern needs to rise into the air as the ship sinks. Just for good measure, I split the bow and stern apart and test them separately to ensure they're able to flood independently. One thing to note is how water filled the compartment at the split in the hull immediately after the ship was placed in the water. Had the ship been heavier, flooding would have spread from this compartment outward, causing the ship to sink from the middle like in that V-break theory, which is not what I want, but if you're into that kind of stuff, seek help. So, to preemptively mitigate this problem, I attempt to reduce weight in the superstructure by performing several minor amputations. In the process, unintentionally disfiguring the A-deck promenade because I'm an actual goober who should never have been allowed near power tools. The final compartment in the bow section is then torn out and placed further near the split so that less water can enter the compartment and weigh the ship down. Just to be safe, I also add one more bulkhead to the stern in the hopes that it'll sink more slowly. After making sure the upper decks can still fit properly following their mutilations, it's time to give the hull some color. I first apply a layer of primer, which will help subsequent layers of paint stick around, instead of leaving like your father did, before mixing up and spraying the ship's red anti-fouling paint. To better convey a sense of scale, I paint the ship's underside with a darker red to create artificial shadows, before going over the rest of the hull with a very subtle layer of pink to create highlights, which more closely matches the actual Titanic's anti-fouling color. Moving vertically up the ship, prepare to paint the upper hull black, but notice that the masking tape doesn't entirely conform to the hull surface, no matter how many obscenities I utter. So I hit the edges of the tape with the same highlight color from before, which in theory should reduce the chances of paint bleeding through the gaps and the chances that I'll pull the trigger. As with the lower hull, I use my airbrush to create artificial lighting, this time using light blue to represent the reflection of the sea and sky on Titanic's sides. Moving up again, I now reach the superstructure. Waterline. Superstructure. Nailed it. The consequences of my flagrant disregard for color theory and reality finally catch up to me as I decide to paint a whole superstructure tan instead of white. I won't realize the error of my ways until it's far too late, so in the meantime I mask off the rest of the superstructure to paint a yellow shear line. With that done and dusted, I can finally ask all this masking tape to leave, revealing that despite my efforts, much of the paint still ended up bleeding through. After calming down, I do my best to rectify this by making a few touch-ups with a paintbrush. While I'm at it, I pick out the raised details on the hull with a highlight color and add some artificial shadows around the iceberg damage. To top off the hull's paint job, I apply the Watertight decals, which must first take a bath in warm water in order to persuade them to leave the backing sheet. It's at this point that Ravel's instructions just start making shit up. Gee, instead of having these depth markers line up with the ship's prow like they do in all the waterline photographs, why don't you just put them smack dab up the middle of the hull? And that, kids, is why you should never take advice from a piece of paper. Alright, enough painting for now. Let's move on to something more interesting. The real white star of today's build is the splitting mechanism. This consists of a lever with a hook on one end and a buoyant weight on the other. The buoyant weight keeps the hook pressed up, which holds the ship together, but when water enters the hull it floats and lowers the hook, which is what allows the stern to detach. For the first iteration of the lever, I trim down a piece of packaging foam for the buoyant weight, build the hook out of laminated pieces of styrene, and add a wall to the open end of the stern for the hook to latch onto. But rather than using an axle as my lever's fulcrum, I instead make the genius decision to just balance the thing on top of the bulkhead. Like my marriage, this obviously wasn't gonna work out, so I come to my senses and fashion a new lever from leftover sprues, this time with an axle. Unfortunately, it still doesn't work, because unless I press the lever down with my hand, the hook isn't hooking. So I partially melt the lever in order to bend the hook downwards, thinking the angle was the problem. But still, no such luck. Now I'm getting desperate. I take a bunch of neodymium magnets, stick a few on the end of the lever, and glue their matching pairs to the bulkhead facing them. If the magnetic force is just enough to snap the lever in place, this thing should work. Although I've strayed a bit from the simple elegance of the original concept, the magnets seem to have done the trick. Never fucking mind.
Descending into a blind rage, the man-child known as Boxman destroys his hard work, even this random bulkhead for some reason. He creates a brand new lever that now has the axis of rotation above the hook. This epiphany wasn't a result of his hidden genius. No, he stole it from Google Images. Unsurprisingly, he failed high school physics, and the new lever works first try.
After replacing the bulkhead I tore out, making the paint job semi-waterproof with a gloss clear coat, gluing down the ship's ballast so it stops sliding around, and taping down the top decks to test the model's stability, it's time to see if the ship can actually split in half. That repurposed plastic drawer wasn't deep enough for a full sinking demonstration, so I ditched it for a large storage container and filled it with dihydrogen monoxide to simulate the effects of water on the ship. I carefully placed the Titanic into the water, and now we wait.
That's a nice sunset, bro.
We've been waiting for half an hour.
Apparently all that painting plugged up the iceberg damage, meaning water couldn't even enter the ship. So I take Titanic back to the shipyard and stab it a few times through the iceberg damage to reopen those holes. With the bow no longer being watertight, the ship immediately begins to pitch down, and before long the bow is fully submerged with water creeping up the superstructure. Suddenly, without warning, the sinking accelerates dramatically. The flooding reaches the buoyant weight, lifts up the lever, which does nothing. Turns out the buoyant weight on the end of the lever wasn't sufficiently buoyant, meaning it couldn't rise quickly enough to release the stern. As if my balls weren't already blue enough, pieces of the superstructure were rubbing against the lever, further reducing its effectiveness. So I went back, amputated the offending sections, and added more foam to double the weight's buoyancy. Since the splitting mechanism is fully operational, I shift my focus back to construction. I'm still concerned about the superstructure being too heavy, so I whip out my rotary tool again to cut out more plastic. If it wasn't already clear I don't know what I'm doing, I ended up accidentally annihilating this wall and gouging out a few chunks of the boat deck. Whoops. Thankfully, the damage to the boat deck is pretty minor, and these walls will be hidden in the superstructure. So the moral to the story is, there are no consequences to mishandling power tools. Now I begin assembling these little houses on top of Titanic's boat deck. In their infinite wisdom, Revell tells you to stick these walls to the boat deck, then glue the roof on top, which is just gobbledygook. I don't know about you, but I personally plan on being able to actually paint my model, so I glue the walls to the roof to keep everything in easily paintable sub-assemblies. Speaking of which, I coat everything in primer before applying the same light tan I erroneously used on the hull. While painting the poop deck, I ended up metaphorically gooning all over it, which ruined the paint below. Thankfully, it's just one layer. If I had spilled something on a completed model, I'd probably have an impromptu wall painting session right then and there, and I'm not talking about busting out a few cans of beer. With the help of 2 kinds of alcohol, I clean up the deck, evict these 2 gentlemen from my airbrush who mistook it for a hot tub, and then repaint the poop deck using the fly juice and paint marinade. I honestly can't be bothered to spend 10 hours masking the wooden deck with thousands of pieces of masking tape, so instead I spent 10 hours painting hundreds of various colored streaks to simulate discoloration in individual wooden planks before covering everything up with a semi-transparent wooden tan. I then paint the various contraptions on the deck with their appropriate colors, such as the ship's anchor chains using black and the deck machinery using green. A glossy surface is optimal for applying washes, so I seal everything with a gloss clear coat before applying a brown wash to the wood to really bring out the texture. As I set my gaze back to the hull, regret begins to sink in. But unfortunately, I can't just put my son up for adoption, so I cope by adding white highlights to brighten up the superstructure. While I'm here, I paint these wooden armrestings by hand, somehow without shitting the bed, and then drown the entire hull in a black wash, wiping it away using a cotton swab after it dries, which leaves behind fake shadows around the innermost crevices of the hull plates. I didn't plan on having any breakup damage, but the crushing emptiness of the gaping void was too much to bear. To take my mind off the battle in the courtroom, I instead set my mind on Titanic's battle against gravity. I glue on a few pieces of styrene to represent shell plating that was torn up when the ship ripped in half, drill a few holes to create portals and windows, and use my tweezers to amplify the violence of the implied breakup. After painting up the damaged plating to match the surrounding hull, I figured that this area could do with some exposed innards like it's a video on Live Leak. So I went ahead and 3D printed Titanic's triple expansion reciprocating engines. Once the engines are removed from their supports, I paint them black, mask off the tops, hit them with yellow, and then finish them off with a black wash to accentuate their details. Following the installation of the engines, I create the ship's decks by cutting up and ripping apart a few pieces of styrene, painting them up, and sticking them into the hull. I got a little carried away and forgot that the splitting mechanism needs space to elevate and depress, so I trimmed the decks in both the bow and stern in order for both sections of the ship to fit together. At the ship's stern, I attached Titanic's 3 massive propellers, which I'm pretty sure will be knocked clean off after a few sinking attempts. Dotting the ship's decks are a variety of machines, which consist of the capstans, cranes, and various ventilators. I noticed that the roof of the first class lounge happens to sit over the splitting mechanism, so I used magnets to secure it, giving me access to the lever in case it gets jammed. Any remaining structures are now glued onto the boat deck, including the lifeboats, which Titanic infamously didn't have enough of. But perhaps the most iconic, maybe overly so, physical attribute of the Titanic was its 4 funnels. I still remember that one time in school when I drew the RMS Lusitania, which also has 4 funnels, proudly got up to show the teacher, only to be crushed by bitter disappointment after she rather ignorantly exclaimed, "Someone get help." Needless to say, my son and I had to leave before security came and return him back to his parents. As construction nears its conclusion, the ship receives its face and masts, atop which sits the crow's nest from where the lookout spotted the fatal iceberg. I keep the decks glued to themselves and not to the hull, which makes it easier to evenly apply a protective clear coat to all the painted surfaces. Tamiya paint isn't waterproof, so I only use Tamiya flat clear as a buffer to seal the enamel washes in case I fuck up when applying the waterproof enamel varnish. The state of this spray can is highly suspect, since it's been sitting on my garage floor for a few years. As expected, halfway into spraying, it stopped working and started leaking, and being too lazy to go out and buy something else, I collected the stuff that came out, diluted it with white spirit, and sprayed it through my airbrush. I wonder why my ship has such a prominent yellow tinge. I prefer the glossy finish from before, but at least this is waterproof. So finally, I slide the deck assemblies into their respective hull sections and unite the bow with the buttocks, completing the model. Now, enough of my incessant jabbering. Let's get on with the thing you clicked the video for. I'm pretty satisfied with the way this build turned out. The way the model sinks is surprisingly authentic, which I think is more a testament to the laws of physics rather than to my incredible craftsmanship. Like with the real Titanic, this model spends most of its time flooding slowly until water reaches the boat deck, at which point it just plunges downward, and chaos ensues. There are a few things that could use improvement. I would have liked it if the stern rose to 45 degrees, like it did in Titanic 1996 and the other one. This one reaches about 20 degrees, which is more in line with recent simulations, but it doesn't look as cool, which is all I really go for. It's a shame that I'm too poor to have my own swimming pool, because I'd probably get put on some kind of list if I pulled up to the YMCA and play with this thing as if I still ride the short bus to school. Time for the ratings. Let's see how Ravel's 1/700th scale Titanic measures up on the Boxman D.I.C.K scale. That's D.I.C spelled D.I.C.K and these are all out of 10. Detail? 6. Interesting to build? 9.3. Craftsmanship, 7. Keen fit, 6.5. Total length, nice try. This model registers a 28.8 out of 40, or an above average 72%. Please note the D.I.C scale is only a measure of the model building experience and does not account for historical accuracy. If you're a beginner modeler looking to build the Titanic, choose this one. If you're still riding the short bus and want to recreate that one toy you could never get your hands on as a kid, this one's not a bad choice. What isn't a bad choice is today's sponsor, World of Warships. Download the game using the link in the description below and use code BRAVO to get a shipload of free stuff. That's it for the content. You can leave if you want. Now I'm just gonna pad out the runtime with channel administration. So I plan to publish 6 videos this summer, within like a 3-month time span, including this one that you're watching right now in probably after late October, so something has gone wrong. And what happened was I based my plan off of the amount of work it took to edit my first 3 videos, which were each done within like a weekend. So now that leaves me with a billion unopened scale models and projects that I planned and I don't really feel like working on now. And that's also led me to reconsider the scope of my channel, my videos, because it's looking like from now on my videos will be taking at least 4 or so months each. And so my main objective now is to make videos that can cater to all audiences and not just scale model enthusiasts. So I'm sorry if I talked to you before in the comments and I promised that I have X model or Y model in my stash, which I do, and I'm gonna make a video on it, which I was. But now I'm kind of realizing each video is gonna be like a multiple month endeavor, and if it bombs, I'm probably gonna kill myself. That's not to say that I'm gonna make some soulless slop for the masses, but I'm gonna focus more on things that I'm personally interested in, that I can make into a more interesting video. So sorry about the guys waiting for that tank video that I posted in the
Waterline
community. I don't know if that's gonna happen anymore. Yeah, sorry. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk, and thank you for 35,000 subscribers. And that's all you'll be subjected to for now. Bye.